This is Rule of Six, the podcast for those who want to do as much as they can with Keyforge. I'm your host, June, and this week I have a brand new guest, Astron. Astron, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Astron. I am the token Australian in the Keyforge community. There's not many of us left, but I'm keeping us around for as long as I can. Yeah, but that's pretty much the best way to sum me up is the Australian.
The Australian, yeah, that's pretty. That is the one thing I think about you in terms of like who you are. You're Australian.
Yeah,
Uh,
easy.
how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. It's been raining all night, so lovely to wake up to no humidity, but actually wake up to some cold. I love the cold. Uh,
Yeah,
but yeah, no, feeling pretty good.
it's winter there, isn't it?
It is. It's the middle of winter.
That's wild.
Yeah, no.
Well, I wanted to bring you on because a while back at KFC, actually, not tonight, and I got started talking about like Keyforge and like deeper ideas, and she mentioned your episode of Sloppy Labwork that she was a huge fan of, and it was your episode on empathy. And can you give like a definition again of how you see empathy in Keyforge?
Yeah, for sure. Had felt at that time that we as players were kind of playing a little selfishly, if you could say it that way, where we would often just play the decks that we're playing and playing through without thinking about what the opponent's trying to do. And so a lot of times people get stumped by the opponent's strategies that they're trying to implement and lose that way when had they spent a little bit of time just thinking about what the opponent wants to do, what's in their deck lists, what turn they're up to, how are they handcrafting, that we could probably actually respond to that before it even happens and out strategize them in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that episode is a really good resource to go back to give like another lens to your play. To, if you're starting to feel like you're stagnating, this is another way in which you can improve, right? Is identifying your opponent's first off their deck, and then second, the player, and then third, the game, right? As I also did recently an episode with Aurora about understanding the matchup, like understanding the player, understanding the deck, how to understand like your role and everything, right?
Mm.
And I wanted to take both these discussions one step forward, meld them a little bit. And you mentioned actually you had been like wanting to you had a lot of ideas on how to like what you're doing during an opponent's turn, right?
Mm.
So during a game, how are you deepening your understanding of what's going on, right? And I thought it was perfect to follow this train of podcast episodes and keep exploring this realm that not a lot of people talk about. What was your opinion what that got all this started?
That's a really good question.
Well, I have repeatedly talked about how I try to slow down during my opponent's turns, right? And generally, I put my hand down, don't even necessarily look at the cards that I've drawn yet,
Mm.
and just kind of try to watch my opponent. And also during mulligans, watching your opponent, especially if you're the second player and you decide second, you get information out of the mulligan, right? That's the exact reason why the first player has to decide first.
Mm.
It's good to take as much advantage of that as you can, but you should be looking at your opponent during your opponent's turn, right? A, so that you don't miss anything, right? Whether it comes to like rules or important things like stealth mode, like like just board effects that or like game state effects that don't enter the board state, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I feel like after watching a lot of the vaults this year, I'm more of an online player at the moment, mostly because I live in Australia and we don't have in person play really. But the biggest rule problems where people have made the most mistakes about the rules is always because not always because, but a lot of the time because only one person's doing their turn and the other person's not paying attention to what the other person's doing. And I feel like that rule could be kept better. The rules could be kept better between both players because both players are responsible for keeping the game state. But it seems like it's only really one person keeping track of the game state and the other person's trying to think about what their own turn is doing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so key cards this would be involved with are, cards like Befuddle, which prevent things during your turn. So prevents you from playing certain houses of cards, or Stealth Mode and Scrambler Storm, which prevent you from playing actions. The Life Ward, which prevents you from playing creatures. Escapee Time Hog, which prevents you from using cards. All these things kind of require you to rethink how your turn's going to play out, right? Before you even call your house. And if you get into it and you haven't understood that these game state changes have happened, you end up with like a game losing turn potentially.
Yeah, 100%. There is even times when someone's increased the key cost and they thought, oh, look, I'm going to go key cheat this next turn.
Yeah.
But they key cheat, and then they realize, oh, wait, you weren't supposed to key cheat, and they have to take it back. Technically should be an infringement or a game loss, but they take it back anyway most of the time because, we're generous people in this community. I think it's acceptable to be generous, but perhaps we shouldn't be as generous so that people can be more, I guess, stricter on themselves in keeping the rules at bay. But I don't know. There's kind of a good point there with that.
Well, like the Keyforge community is generous, but I feel like sometimes the generosity is taken for granted in those kinds of situations, right? You should be able to be generous, but you shouldn't feel like that's the expectation, right? For you to keep your opponent to different standards than you, right? And you should fully have the right to, call a judge, uphold the game state, right?
It's stressful. It's a stressful thing to do, though. I've had to do it in other card games and in Keyforge, where my opponent has done something. I'm like, that wasn't quite correct. Can I please get a judge to get me to understand what was going on? I think that you should definitely be doing that. If you don't understand what happened, please get a judge. Don't just trust that your opponent is doing doing the right thing. Like, we should be nice about it, but if you don't know, like, the judge is going to know. So it's okay to do those things. It's scary, but we should be more aware that the judges are there not just to infringe rules, but to also be there to help us. And I think that's something that we do not enough of.
Yeah, like calling the judge is not like calling the cops or telling the teacher on somebody. It's like asking for help, right? This is, I don't quite understand the implications of what happened. So let me call like an expert on the rules, right? Because the rules get pretty deep and then the interactions even deeper. So having an expert there who's not focused on the tempo of the game, right? Because that's another thing is you lose a lot of focus if you start worrying about these like meta aspects of the game.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it should feel like your responsibility, honestly, to understand what's happening during your opponent's turn. And if you get caught by that, like that's on you. Like,
Yeah, 100%. And then if we're both paying attention to each other's turns throughout the game, it actually doesn't just help us with the rules, but it helps us to get into deeper strategy and understanding what the opponent wants to do, which is kind of building on from my empathy episode that I did. And I think that's something that I'm really interested in talking about today in general. Yeah.
So to even begin to understand what your opponent wants to do, you probably have to understand what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
And that involves seeing what cards they mill, seeing what cards they archive, right? Because that's information that goes away. That becomes hidden information. And if you ask what they'd archive, the window to learn that has closed.
Mm-hmm.
And if you miss these like key aspects, it's like texting while you're driving, right? You have a large blackout period, and then you're suddenly trying to understand what's happening again. And driving blind is like not it's not easy. It's not good. Um I see it that way, right?
No, it's a
Like,
great analogy. I love it.
and yeah, I guess while I'm playing, I like to drive with my eyes open. And it can take a bit more time, which requires you to perform cleaner play, right? So
Hmm.
have a good idea of what your deck does, what you need to do, and understand the rules, implications of how things work, right? So if I were to take, for example, hypothetically, a witch queen turn, right? Like, I need to understand what witch queen does and the order in which things need to trigger, so I'm not thinking about the implications of every action. That gives me sometimes 10 extra minutes in a game with which I can a win the game, or b use it to spend time understanding what my opponent's doing and give myself my own time to think. Right?
Yeah, it's it's really important that we spend time on the opponent's turn in that, because I think we have let the Crucible online take a lot of the load of what we're trying to do in our turns. It's because it keeps track of everything, and so we see the cards that have come out, and so we know exactly what's going on. So we've kind of got accustomed to, well, I can walk away from my computer, even come back, and I can look at what my opponent just previously did, and then take my turn. But there is so much nuance that goes on a turn, even from the timing it takes for someone to take their turn, to the time it takes to between specific cards, and the time it takes between the last card they played and them ending their turn. You know how often people do that? It just tells you they have a card in hand that's good card, and they're unsure if they want to keep it or not, or if they want to discard it or play it. And you can get so much information off that, of what the opponent's nuances are in their timing of their turn, of when they're going to play specific actions. So not only is it important to pay attention to that on your opponent's turn, but when it's on your turn, be conscious of those things. Take the time at the start of your turn so that you can play your turn out fluently. So it's less tells for the opponent, because you're kind of playing a little bit of poker. And you got to have a bit of a poker face, because you can give a lot of information based on your behavior, based on how you played your cards, based on how you're holding the cards. Like, even I see people when I watch the Vault Tours, they'll take all the cards of the house they're going to play, keep it, and put the rest face down. And
Yeah.
I'm like, well, I know exactly how many cards they're going to play this turn. So let's think about what their other cards are in their hand, as well as what they're about to play and what they're going to play in what order.
And I think there are certain styles of decks which care more about reading the game, right?
Yeah.
So if you're playing with too much to protect, or you have a key artifact you need to purge, there are times where it's like the timing of things is hugely important. But even like if you're just playing a deck that wants the board, knowing where your opponent's board wipes are can be really huge. So it's always important, but there are cases of huge cards that cause wild swings of the game you need to be mindful of. Watching your opponent's turn, reading their hands is like so key in a matchup with like too much to protect.
And maybe that's why I think about my opponent's turns a lot, because some of my favorite decks do have too much to protect. Another card that these decks also have is Key to Dis. That card makes people, maybe it makes their brains go on a spin cycle, because they're like, when are they going to play it? When are they going to use it? When are they going to use it? So they try to like manipulate it by going, I'm going to play some creatures now. I'm like, you can have those creatures. And then it's just this mind games of when you're going to play that, use that card to get
Mhm.
the most value out of it, because some players are trying to bait you into using it so that they can play lots of creatures the turn after and try and win a game through that way. So there's definitely ways that we need to consider on behaviors throughout the game.
What are the kind of behaviors we're looking for? You mentioned a bunch of examples. For example, like their pauses, right? So how do you read into those?
Their pauses, yeah. I think the easiest one to tell is the time between their last card and passing turn. If you see that there is a delay, someone is usually, most of the time, contemplating another action or another something to do with their turn, whether it's discarding a card, playing a card, using a card on the board. When you see the time it takes for them to do that, and they don't play that card or don't do something, then you can at least think about it for later turns. Like, look, they've been planning this card for some time. So maybe I need to either force that card early, or I need to just be considerate of it on my own turns, because I'm not going to let them just keep that too much protect in their hand for as long as possible. I'm not going to let them keep that board wipe in hand as long as possible. I can. It might give them a chain, but I also would rather the game to just keep flowing in my direction, in my control. I don't want them to have control over the tempo of the game.
Right. One of the examples, too much to protect, right? So I actually on either side of the board, right? So they take a pause and you have too much to protect in your deck. They're thinking about how much can I afford to let them steal, right? So possibly like they're holding out on reaps or playing cards, important burst cards and whatnot. Or conversely, we're early in the game and they have too much to protect, right? So what are like they're thinking, how long can I chain myself, right? Do I just want this amber now and we'll figure out the rest later? There's specific ways to think about too much to protect, but I think actually it is interesting to think about which different cards they could be holding, right? So board wipes, right? So the main thing you're thinking about is like how many creatures you play out, or like how you make use of your creatures.
We always think about the tempo swing cards when
Right.
we look at the timing it takes for people to play specific cards. So there are definitely cards that are not just the tempo swing cards that we should think about on the opponent's turn, like based on timing. Cards like Infernus, or cards that give like their own tempo swings, like Cronus as well. Some people want to get a lot of value out of their cards, and if they see that your discard pile doesn't have many Amber Pips, then maybe they won't bother with Infernus. Or maybe they're waiting on you to get rid of all your board control so that they can purge it for a late game strategy, because their deck is based around creatures. These sort of things are they're tempo swings, but they're delayed tempo swings.
Mhm.
So it's not just, oh, I need to think about the board wipe, or I need to think about the too much to protect, or whatever massive swing card there is. There are cards that give slight tempo swings throughout the game that can lead towards a win for that player in the end game. There is a deck that I play. I love the deck. It has no creature control, but it has an Infernus and lots of creatures. And every time I'll just wait on my Infernus. I don't need to play it yet. It's not valuable yet until I get rid of their board control. You may not feel the rewards now, but that delayed reward often can lead to a win. And that's something that does take up time on my turn as to whether I should play my card or not. And so I can hold it, but I shouldn't try to tell people that I'm holding it by giving too much pause on my turn.
Right. So from the opposite side of the table, what do you do with that information?
I think that kind of comes into the whole thing of handcrafting, right? When people thought about handcrafting for the first time, it was a phenomenal idea that everyone adapted really quickly. But the issue with it, and it's a great strategy, but you can read what the opponent has in their hand the way that they're handcrafting. If they're playing 1 to 2 creatures and you look at their discard pile, I like to do a little count of what house has been played and go, well, they're about to play this house. What are the threats in that house? Oh, they didn't play that threat, but they did play that house. Maybe that card's still in their hand, or they haven't drawn it yet. So that's something I like to think about on my opponent's turn, is how are they handcrafting, as well as how am I using my deck to manipulate that handcrafting too?
Yeah. Well, some people have, like you mentioned, a habit of sorting out their hand, right? Actually, a lot of people will sort out their hand into houses, even if they're not physically separating them, is a risk. Honestly, it shows you exactly how you're handcrafting. Um, I make a habit of after my turns when I put down my hand and I draw cards, I shuffle it up, right? So my opponent loses any information they've gained. Well, most of the information they've gained. They can still understand, how I'm playing with cards versus board when I'm continuing to push a house to handcraft other houses. But there is something gained not only from the balance of houses, like you said, that your opponent's playing, but like the specific locations of cards, right? Or even just like how often they check their archives, right? They check their archive every turn, let's say, and on disc turns they look for a little bit longer. Maybe they have a discard.
Yeah, no, that's something because I'm an online player like predominantly. It's not something I always think about, but I need to be considerate of that. Even like the amount of times you look at your opponent's discard pile, like, well, they have a befuddle or they have a control the weak. How am I going to deal with that? Well, I want to have an equal number of creatures on the board of different houses, even if it's a little bit inefficient, because it means that I'm not going to just be losing an entire turn. That's something I like to think about. At least I should be thinking about when I'm in-person play is how are they holding their hand? If they're not shuffling their hand around, how are they looking at their discard pile? How are they looking at the archives? Like even especially the hand. I come from other card games at some point in my life. I am a board gamer at heart, but I do play other card games, and it is so important that you are not showing to your opponent what is in your hand, because and if you're holding the cards in a specific way and you keep one card like off to that left every single turn, I'm paying attention to that. I will know that that card's been there for the entire last 4 or 5 turns. So you're giving so much information away. You need to be constantly moving your cards around. And it's why we see that crazy weird shuffle that some people do where they flick the cards around. It's like, what are you doing? Why are you just like feels like you're going to damage your cards? It's like, I don't want you to know what I have in my hand. So in other card games, it's more important because I feel like there's more interaction on your opponent's turn. There is definitely more interaction on your opponent's turn. So that's why you want to consider what cards are in your hand. But because this Keyforge is a game where you don't do things to your opponent's turn, we kind of lost that skill of paying attention in the opponent's turn and lost that skill of paying attention to how they are holding their cards or how they're looking at their discard pile. The time it takes to look through their archives or look through your discard pile, like what all these nuances can build up to kind of making the hand almost like you can almost have an X-ray on their hand to know what's in their hand.
Yeah, it's like so crazy that we've lost that skill when actually like we've taken for granted the fact that we're given so much more time to do it, right? Because we don't have to think about our own stuff during their turn. We don't interact during the turn. We're allowed more than any other game almost to spend that time understanding their turn.
Yeah, from what I've seen, we spend that time planning our next turn, and then things happen. We're like, well, I wish I wasn't planning my turn because now I can't do what I wanted to do.
Right. That's another reason why I tell people to, put down their hand during their opponent's turn. If you start formulating a plan, right, and you get this idea of exactly what you're going to do, you might be resistant to changing that plan. Depending on like the plasticity of your brain, like you might not be able to focus on any other plan, right? I think being open to like the new information, right, starting from the top is beneficial. Like you might just have like a subconscious bias towards this plan you've already made, right? Because you've connected to it, you see how it's good, and that goes beyond that, making plans even before a game, right? It is important to make plans and stick to them when it comes to like game strategy, right? But if you're looking for specific combos, specific hands, specific types of actions, you can lose the forest through the trees.
Yeah.
And you mentioned looking through somebody's discard, right? And I think that's a great one. And even more so now with Grim Reminders. There's so many cards that interact with whether your opponent is haunted or not, or what kind of cards occupy their discard.
Mm-hmm.
And so if your opponent starts looking through their own discard, your discard, counting up, you might have an idea of what card they're planning for. They might be thinking about Memorialize the Fallen. So you're contending for a key, and maybe checking if they are going to lose amber or if they'll cause you to lose enough amber. Or say Winds of Death. They may be weighing whether they want to play Winds of Death based off of the specific creatures in your discard, right? There are a lot of cases, I think, where they're looking for something. Circle Speak's a great one. You're shaking your head. Circle Speak is a unfathomable action from Grim Reminders. It has an amber pip, and when you play it, you choose a creature that is going to capture amber from each player that's haunted, right? So if you choose your opponent's creature and your opponent is haunted, it's going to capture from its own side. Now, there's a number of ways to like think about this card. One of them is not to play any creatures, but that's not always tenable, right? You may need your creatures. You may need to push an advantage. You may already be stuck with creatures, and so if your opponent is looking at your discard and counts up to 8 cards, and they're like, okay, and they hold a card, like, yeah, it's Circle Speak. I think in Grim Reminders, it takes on like a whole new context.
Yeah, what you said about looking through that discard pile, I have been guilty of this, where I forget about cards like Boo and that they have discarded a bunch of cards. So I've actually spent games playing around very dangerous card.
Mm-hmm.
And then I realize right at the end before they're about to draw that it's been in that discard pile the entire time. And I'm like, what was I doing? I learned nothing other than I wasn't paying attention. And so finding out what they hit with Boo is massive. Like, we handcraft so often in this game. We can work out exactly what like amber control there is, what creature control there is. And if we are counting the cards that they've played or that they've been discarded, we can kind of work out the order of the houses that they're going to play for the rest of the game most of the time. And we can go, look, they haven't been playing Unfathomable in a while. What key cards in Unfathomable are going to be a problem? Well, they've got Circle Speak they haven't played yet. So that's probably going to be in hand. That's something I need to think about. Oh, they have a catch and release, which what catch and release does is it returns all creatures from both players' boards back to their hand and then discards cards from each player down to 6 randomly, giving that player 2 chains. And so sometimes you just need to be discarding those creatures if you don't want to lose the key cards in your hand, or you need to be considerate of what is your counter to what they're going to do. Can I do something before they're going to do something? How am I going to make my deck work with what their deck is currently doing or has done?
I think on the Crucible specifically, it's really hard to internalize what happens after a Boo, right? Because it doesn't list out the cards, so you may easily miss something. Yeah, even if you like looked away, you may not even realize they played Boo, right? There's a lot to look through there, and like during your opponent's turn in real life, they play Boo. They may like flip through the cards, but you have full right to look through their discard during their turn, so you can take a second look, internalize that. I think I see a lot of players that win Vault Tours doing that. Like after any large change in information, right? They take time to internalize it. If a board of tokens is wiped, they take time to internalize what those tokens were, you know?
Yeah. And I think that's something there's also like cards like Punctuate Equilibrium. If you play Punctuate Equilibrium right at the end of the deck, on TCO, it doesn't show you what the cards are that were discarded, and you actually need to ask for that information because it's meant to be public information. Yeah. But in IRL, it's not that you can see the cards that have been discarded before the redraw. That's actually another card that I think that is the card that got me to realize the importance of paying attention to your opponent's turn. I had, I guess, a mentor in Keyforge in the early days. Around, let's say, it was still COVID, so probably around the time, if anyone was around at KFPL 2 or 1, something like that. That was just the time frame that we were playing in. And I was asking him about a matchup, and he's like, well, they're probably going to be doing this on turn 7. So get ready to play Punctuate Equilibrium on that turn. Or if you can see that they're about to play their handcrafting for it, do it a little bit earlier, and you'll discard their entire deck strategy, and there's nothing they can do about it. And it went exactly as he said it. And I was like, what? How can you tell this? How do you know this? And it's something that I just really am glad that I learned from it, because I didn't realize the significance of what turn that it is up to and what cards have been played at this point. I didn't actually play it on turn 7. I tried to read the hand and went, look, he hasn't played this house in some time. He wants to board wipe, arise all his disc creatures, and then control the weak me into a house that can't deal with it. And it was gone because I got rid of the arise and the board wipe. And it was an adaptive match. And he hadn't planned for that. And I did what his deck did back to him. I did the board wipe, arise, and then control the weak, and that was pretty much game. It was such a gratifying moment to realize the significance of understanding your opponent. And I think that the significant point in my understanding Keyforge that pushed me to want to understand the game even further.
Yeah. I think for a lot of people, it takes that moment, right, to make a guess, more than a guess, like a real hypothesis, right? Draft a conclusion and try something out and then be rewarded. Those are the kinds of things that, sink you deeper in love with the game, right? They get their claws in you. And you start wondering what else you can do to play better. It might take that moment for a lot of people to start seeing how understanding their opponent's turns helps them. I think once you do, I don't know, it's like seeing in color, right? It gives so much more context to what's going on.
And a little caveat, it doesn't always work because randomness exists. And it wouldn't be a card game if it didn't have randomness. You can play the best that you can possibly play to outplay your opponent, to beat them, and use their deck against them while you kind of melding your strategies together. But sometimes RNG just says no, and we have to kind of accept that. I struggle with accepting it because I feel like I can play better than my opponent, and then if I lose, I'm like, I played better than them. Why did I deserve this loss? Well, I didn't, but luck is involved, and we have to kind of accept that too.
Yeah, I mean, even the most favored matchups will lose, right? You can always lose. Like, I've learned that I can always lose. I like to talk like I can, but there's no harm in being prepared, right? It might not go as you plan. It didn't hurt to think about it, and perhaps it really helped.
And I liked what you guys were talking about. Was it with Gorlami about matchups?
Yeah, recently we were talking about outs.
Outs, that's right. And how you can kind of build a strategy by looking at your opponent's deck list at the start of the game. Some people go through like a ritual where they're like, okay, what are the creature control? What is the amber control? How many pips? How many creatures? Some people might go further and go, what is the overall deck strategy? Where are the random enhancements? Where have they landed? What is the house distribution? Those things are much more advanced, I would say, and not always necessary. Sometimes you can get overloaded cognitively. And so it's important to think about those things. But I definitely want to, when I look at a deck list, go, well, what do they want to do to win?
Right.
And how am I going to build my deck strategy? How am I going to turn my way of winning and their way of winning to be favored towards me? And so you can kind of, from a deck strategy, work out the direction it wants to take. And then from that, do the things that we've been talking about, where you understand where cards are landing, the time it takes for cards to be played, how are they handcrafting, and you can do a pretty good estimation of where their deck is about to be, like what part of their game plan their deck is at.
Right. Yeah, in which case, what I talked about with Roar is like super relevant. Not just thinking about your opponent's deck as a series of scary cards, right? It's not simply the 5 scariest cards in their deck. it wants to do something too. Like it's well, most of the time there are some decks that that seemingly only want to react. Understanding further than that, like past what you should just be looking for, right? Because if you don't, it's like I don't know, it's like just sitting in lecture in like college and only perking your ears up when they ask questions, right? It's like, oh, you didn't learn anything. And I think similarly, there's a lot to read, right? And actually, I'm regretting this now, talking about it so late. We've been talking a lot about handcrafting. What is handcrafting, especially in the context of this?
Oh, very true. I hadn't even thought about not explaining it. So, handcrafting is you kind of manipulating your draws so that you're going to have mathematically more cards to play every turn. So, early on in the game, it's okay to play 1 to 2 cards of a house, even if you have 3 to 4 cards of another house. Because if you once you played those 1 to 2 cards, of that, say you play Shadows and you got a bunch of Logos cards in your hand, you're more than statistically likely to draw more Logos cards. And then you get to play 5 Logos cards. And when you draw 5 new cards, you're likely to draw 4 of another house. And so you keep kind of steamrolling that large hand play. And it looks like you're just getting the best draws of your life because you're playing 4 to 5 cards of a house every single turn because you sacrificed a couple of turns early on. Sometimes you have to do that in the middle of a game because, randomness just kind of went, oh, look, you're going to draw 3, 2, and 1. Well, let's play out that 1, even though it makes no sense to play out that 1 because I've already played 7 cards or 8 cards of that house. I'm not going to draw it. Well, I'm less likely to draw it. And so, yeah, considering what cards are coming and what houses you played, you kind of want to manipulate it so that you're always drawing the most of a new house.
Yeah. When you say manipulating your draws, you don't mean like stacking your deck. Almost more like manipulating which cards you keep in hand, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, if for example, you always had two hands. Like that was just it just always happened. And when you drew those, you would only play, let's say, Brobnar. So you played the 2 Brobnar, the 2 Brobnar, the 2 Brobnar, the 2 Brobnar over and over and over again. Eventually you run out of Brobnar, right?
Please never switch houses. If you've got 2/2/2, please never switch. It's the worst idea.
Right. So you can eventually not only break yourself out of it, but be like highly rewarded with 2 house hands for the rest of your deck. And so in the context of like watching your opponent's handcrafting, watching out for when they take small turns gives you an idea for what to expect next, right? If they're just playing the same board out, right, it can feel really tempting to play a board wipe if they're just using the same 3 creatures over and over, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just like playing one card. But at the same time, perhaps their deck really wants to play a bunch of creatures out, right? And so what they're holding back are are more creatures, right? So if you the moment you wipe the board, their plan is to reflood it, right? They've already got the backup, and they can just keep using it. So like understanding that is so key for, I mean, these, like we've talked about, like these big tempo swing cards. But maybe there are ways you can deal with these threats without without hitting the nuke button, right? You don't need to blow everything up. Maybe you can just make it worse for them to handcraft, right? And that might be game winning.
Even like minute strategies of they might have when we say a witch on the board. Yes, there's witches in this game, but I mean a witch in the sense that it must be burnt, it must die. So we must get that card off the board as soon as possible.
Whether it has like a really scary like after reap,
Yeah,
or it has like a passive effect that just guts you like kelp or something.
but sometimes that scary card that needs to be used, they will likely not have. They can likely not have cards in their hand of that house. So you spending resources to kill that card, it it probably didn't matter that turn because if they wanted to use it, they needed to be inefficient on their hand and their game to use it. Like a card that like Witch of the Eye, which allows you to bring a card back from the discard pile. Those cards are scary, but you don't need to kill them straight away if you can realize what hands they've been playing, what houses they've got. Sometimes you can even deliberately kill everything else except that card to give them a decision point. And I love giving my opponent decision points. It is when I can add more decisions to my opponent's turn, it makes me feel good because they have to think harder. They have to think longer. If you see that you can clear some cards on the board, clear it so that it's one of every house. And
Right.
then they now have to go, well, I wanted to use that card, but I've only got one of that card in my hand, and I've got more of the other cards in my hand. You make their decisions either more difficult or even, in some circumstances, very streamlined so that you can pretty much control the tempo of their game and make it that they're playing what you want them to play.
Right. So they've gotten a huge board in two other houses. You're able to reduce their board to just shadows
Yeah,
and go to 8 amber, right? They're going to do too much to protect maybe.
that is true.
And then you can burst up next turn, right? There's a lot of practical applications of that. And I think the idea of increasing your opponent's options could almost be a topic in its own right, right? Like
Definitely.
there's a lot of ways you can do that. But understanding what your opponent's decision points already are is like a good starting point for that, I think.
What is interesting is that something I guess that helped me understand a lot of reading my opponent's turn is playing reactive decks. Reactive decks are decks that gain the most value, or the cards in their deck gain the most value depending on what the opponent has done. So for me, my favorite decks have too much to protect. So when I pay attention to my opponent's turn, I want to see what they're going to do and how can I use too much protect to the most value. It's a tricky card to use because a lot of players that are really good at the game like to, I guess, bait the card. And so I pay attention to those sorts of things. I don't need to necessarily play it when they want me to play it. I may never play the card because I like to keep it as always as a scare factor and then burst on my own turns to try to keep ahead of them because in itself, too much protect has slowed the opponent down. They can't go up really high. So it's doing its job, even if it's a chain in my hand. Or even cards like Infernus, like I was saying before. Infernus, I want to pay attention to what they're trying to do so that I can remove the key cards. Like if I realize that the opponent wants to win through Keyfrog, I want to make sure that card is when it's in the discard pile, or as soon as it's in the discard pile, I want to purge it with Infernus. So the decks that I like a lot are reactive decks, where they pay attention to what the opponent wants to do, and then uses that against them. I love those kinds of decks. I think they are very powerful in some regard, but they also get less powerful the more your opponent understands your deck too. That's something to be considerate of because I have lost games where my opponent has done what I've been doing to them back to me, where they have just kept going to 8 every single turn with too much to protect. And I'm like, well, I'm not really slowing them down, am I? I tried to, but in order to slow them down, I needed other cards to remove their amber, but I never had them. And so they've kind of made me do what they want to do. I love cards, reactive cards like that bounce cards back to hand, because as I said, handcrafting is pretty significant. And if I'm paying attention to what houses they're playing, well, I want to bounce cards back to the hand in a way that makes that handcrafting really annoying. So not necessarily bouncing the same house back to the hand that they just played, or playing at least one house back to the hand, one card back to the hand from that house, and then another card. So now they're stuck with this decision point of, well, I want to handcraft those cards back out, but now I'm going to be stuck drawing one less card because of this other card in my hand.
Right.
So making the opponent's decisions harder because you are reacting to what they're trying to do.
Right. And in a case like bounce, like let's say Dragonet returns 3 of your creatures of the same house back to your hand, which can be a real pain. Throw this right back, right? Like maybe they hold a card, right? And maybe that card was another Dragonet or a Maelstrom, right? So if you go back to your turn and you have 9 cards and a bunch of creatures, you're like, well, I want to go back to handcrafting, so let me play all these out. You're just going to get punished right again. There are cases where you can try to understand your opponent's turn right back at them and just say, okay, I'm going to discard them, right? I understand the threat. I've looked at the rest of their deck. They haven't played these cards yet, and they took a little extra time. This is probably what happened. It's the moments that you start realizing that there are these exchanges that like the game can get like crazy deep. Like you get past just the cards, right? You get to your opponent, right? Which is really what these games are about. Is about you and your opponent, ideally, right? You don't want to just be your cards. When I sit down at the table, I don't want to just be my cards. I don't want to just be my deck. It should ideally be about me and my opponent, right? Like that's should be what determines the game. And yeah, there's chance, but I think respecting that both ways is highly important. Well, I think it's really funny that you mentioned too much to protect, or like that you never play it, right? And sometimes I do the same with like Dysania, and I think is really funny. So that's my too much to protect, because I don't really play decks with that. But Dysania is a creature that discards your entire opponent's archives, which archives are real good in Keyforge, turns out. And then not only that, which is crippling enough, you gain amber for each one discarded. So it goes real crazy. It's like it is an insane swing in tempo. On par with it, too much to protect, if not sometimes better. And so understanding when to play it's really important, or sometimes just the threat of not playing it, right? Like maybe you've archived it, and that's where it's going to stay for a while.
Or discarding it against a Winds of Death deck.
Yeah, well, that's secret tech. And actually, I was playing Sealed Vault Masters recently. I think I was just at a tournament.
That's cool.
And we got Vault Masters in our goodie bag. Lucky us. And we're like, well, we're like all registered. We're waiting for people to get here so we can play Sealed Grim Reminders. We're not allowed to open them. Let's play our Vault Masters decks, right? And Too Much to Protect is in the Vault Master 24. And in Sealed, just by virtue of Too Much to Protect existing in the set, Shadows is really good. Because in Sealed you may have to play against Too Much to Protect. You have to assume that it could be there. It's an uncommon, right? So it'll show up in a fair number of decks with Shadows. Sealed is a great way to think about understanding your opponent's decks, right? It's crucial.
Very much so.
Like understanding what they're playing towards, or even just like understanding what cards hit the discard pile, what information you get, right? That's important for later.
Yeah, even just something simple like the roles that different houses have. I remember I played a lot of Sealed Mass Mutations, because I used to hang out with the Archon's Corner crew for their weekly night Sealeds. You learn even just the combinations of the houses that come together. You're like, well, I see Logos Untamed Sanctum. they're most likely going to be making quick amber generation, or even Shadow's Star Alliance Untamed. They're going to probably try to make lots of amber really quickly. And you can work out the roles that houses play. If you see someone with Geistoid, well, that house has a significant role in a lot of decks, and you can see most of the time it's probably wanting to put things into the discard pile and then archive them. That's just kind of what makes Geistoid so broken. So if you see that in a Grim Reminder Sealed, you're like, well, I'm scared that they could do that. And then I see Mars, and I'm like, damn, they probably have key abduction, or they might have these stupid Mars Rebel combos that exists. Like, those are the sort of things that you need to consider. So paying attention to your opponent's turn can help you learn these things, and you can, if you make not necessarily a checklist, but if you have like a bingo board, I guess, in your brain of the kinds of cards or threats that could exist, you can slowly cross them off to say, no, they probably don't have that card because, well, for one, they don't have that house, or they don't have that card because they're trying to play in this sort of way. And you can, I guess, work out strategies of the opponent's decks from the behaviors that they're doing. And it's a really difficult task. It's something that takes a lot of time to nurture, to build on. And it's something that definitely took me a while to get the hang of. And I still don't do it well enough that I would like to do it. I'd like to do it more.
Right. Yeah. I think, eventually you got to get started, right? You may have that moment where you get really rewarded and you get addicted to it. But I think to get there, I don't know, just start watching your opponent's turns. I did that recently, and I realized how much I was missing, right? So I think even just discovering how much you get out of watching, even if it's not even new information, right? Like information you would have got, like you probably would have gotten otherwise, being able to internalize it, right? Seeing how the cards move is like so important, and it's like honestly a privilege of playing in person that I appreciate over the Crucible. Is seeing where the cards move helps me understand and like internalize where everything is. That helps you play for the rest of the game, right? So I think just starting, right?
Yeah.
Just start.
Even like understanding what they do with their creatures, like, oh, they fought with their creatures on their turn. Why did they fight with their creatures? Why didn't they just reap to get to cells to check? It's like, I didn't have that threatened. My cards weren't that threatening on the board. What was the reason for their fighting? And so, like in Sealed, like, oh, maybe they don't really have much creature control. Maybe they they have to fight in order to keep control of the board, or maybe they, in non-sealed, they didn't draw those cards, and so they realize that if they don't deal with the board now, it's going to get out of hand. And so, yeah, by just paying attention, by just spending time, even playing decks that you're unfamiliar with, to just learn what the game is wanting you to do. Because I feel like the game has a song or a rhythm or a tempo, and depending on how much we dance with it, it will help guide us towards a win. Maybe it decided it was the opponent's turn to win this game. That's what RNG is involved, but we can work with it and build towards our own strategies by just spending time paying attention.
You'll figure out how you can use that information later, but just watch. Just watch, you'll see. On that note, I want to move to the end of our episode. Do you have any other advice for our listeners?
I do. For a long time, when I played this game, I thought that my successes and what I did in the game mattered to other people. I thought that if I could keep trying to my best to win and try my best to get to the top, that people would want to, I don't know, would like that. But in the end, it's not what matters in this game. What matters in this game is just having fun and just enjoying what you're doing. And you may win because you're enjoying yourself, but if you focus too much on the win, you get stressed out. And I was probably quite a grumpy or not a nice person to some people in the past, and I definitely apologize for that, and I definitely regret what I'd become. And I'd like to just say to myself that you should just enjoy the game because it matters more and it makes the game fun. So don't worry.
Don't worry. Yeah. But yeah, it's like it's your don't pee in the well that you drink from, right?
Be in the well that you drink from. Love it.
You like make the community a good place. Have fun and have fun with your opponent, right? Because you're there together. I think that's really good advice.
So I do stream on Twitch, not in the most consistent manner, but I stream on Twitch at Astron624. You can find me pretty easily. It's Keyforge content. It's mostly the Nordic Keyforge League content because I love playing in their leagues. I've spent a lot of time in that server. I also have spent some time in various Discords. If you want to message me about anything about this topic, I'd love to hear, love to chat. I love chatting about the game, and especially at a higher depth. I think that's one of the coolest parts about this game. But yeah, I'm on Twitch or in Discord.
Yeah. And actually, you recently covered the Vietnam Vault Tour in English, right? So they had their own coverage. You gave your own commentary for everyone in English.
Yeah, I hope to, in the next, after I finish some assessments for university work, I want to cut up the content so that you can get just the games with the game titles without all the added fluff. So hopefully within a few weeks, you'll start to see those individual games pop up with my commentary and make it a more digestible content for you guys instead of trying to just scroll through a large VOD from Twitch, which can be very tedious. But yeah, that's something that I'm working on at the moment.
And that'll be on the YouTube channel?
Yeah, it's the same name, I believe. I haven't done enough YouTube, but I'm moving into the YouTube territory.
Okay, cool. And until then, they can find the VODs on Twitch, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I watched it. There were some really cool games. It was really fascinating watching Alliance in other communities. I think, honestly, people need to watch more Keyforge outside of the US. People need to watch more. There's so much more than what happens here. I think channels like hers are doing really great for highlighting all of that.
We should thank Riku, though, for the work that he put in for that Vault Tour.
Yes.
It looked incredible. The overlay where they had live amber tracking and keys tracking, they had beautiful lighting. They just ran such a great schedule, and he couldn't even play. He's not allowed to play because he's organizing it. So for him to do that for other people, such a selfless act that I think we just need to give him a lot of thanks for that.
Absolutely. I don't think it should be understated. Riku's an incredible player. Riku could easily win a Vault Tour, in my opinion. And yeah, he gave up a lot. And I really appreciate what people do for the community in favor of playing. Like, there's a lot of cases where that happened, whether you're a judge or you're a tournament organizer, a member of Ghost Galaxy, honestly. Like, there's a lot of people who do really great things, and I think we gotta appreciate them. This has been Rule of Six. Check out our Discord in the show notes where you can write listener mail, and you can also write listener mail to our Gmail in the show notes. Thank you for listening this week, and I'll see you next Friday. And don't forget to pull your archives.